Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, July 31st, 2018. Good, fine. I hate you, July. I'm done with you. I had a very good July. I love July. Come back. Don't leave just yet. And, hey, don't be a stranger. Come on back next year. Why don't you? And we'll have a great time, I'm sure. All right, good morning. It is time for another show. And time for another voice to join the show. Not quite yet, but in our 10 o'clock hour, we will, as I announced in this morning's Morning Post, and it's a huge announcement. I mean, it's a regular announcement. It's great. It's nice. It's been a long time since we have had our own Daily Coast professor, Professor Ian Reifowitz, join us. And I don't think you have to even call him professor. So it's a really nice way to get in good and get, everyone likes to get in good with the professors. I feel like I'm being graded. I'm already nervous. I have office hours scheduled with the professor. This is difficult. No, it's really not. And lots to talk about, as always. And, of course, those of you who have kept up with what he's been writing on Sundays at Daily Coast have never found yourself disappointed. And we got an interesting new one from last Sunday that we can look into. And I guess the tax issue is going to be back in the news. Taxes are always in the news, of course. But his last Sunday piece on the 29th, the Trump tax plan was a lie. Corporate tax revenue now at a 75-year low. Meanwhile, by the way, corporate profits at record highs, of course, and stock markets approaching record highs. No one's feeling the effects of that, except that select few. And I guess things are slated to get even worse if the so-called Trump administration gets its way on a few other things they're likely to tinker with. And guess what? Because they're such deficit hawks, the 2019 deficit looks to top $1 trillion because they're super serious about the deficit over there on the Republican side, and Democrats must do everything they can to tighten their belts and make tough choices to make people who are looking to the rest of us for a little bit of help in getting by suffer a little bit more so that we can bring down our deficit and, I don't know what, look good to banks around the world. I'm not really sure what it is, but of course it doesn't matter because we're not doing that either. And honestly, the truth is it may never have mattered in the first place anyway, even when Republicans were easier to take seriously when they railed about the deficit. It never mattered. But hey, who am I to get in the way of a good story? And I won't. And neither will Ian, and we'll get together in the 10 o'clock hour and discuss some of that nonsense and exactly what might be coming up next. In the meantime, let's take a look around at Pocket and at our Kagro in the Morning Twitter feed. Don't forget about that one. The KITM hashtag is a great way to give your tweet to me a fighting chance to perhaps stay up on screen long enough for me to find it or scroll back and take a look. Already, Michael Musson has kicked off the discussion this morning among KITM listeners, wondering, as the president has toddled out of bed, I guess he read in the newspaper or saw on TV that thing about plastic guns. And I guess, is today some sort of a milestone or a deadline of some kind? I think if I haven't followed the story all that closely, and I guess my wildly unpopular opinion among gun safety folks anyway about these 3D guns is that, the ones that exist now, the one about which we're fighting in court and which I think is at the center of the controversy is the first. It's the first gun to have been assembled from three-dimensional printed plastic parts, though it's not entirely made of plastic. There are still a few pieces that still just need to be made of metal, and I think the firing pin among them. And I think the current design might even use a few metal rivets to just sort of hold things in place. But as I understand it, the issue is whether or not the government can step in and prevent the dissemination of the computer instructions, basically the software that allows, that instructs a printer to a 3D printer to make one of these things. And all by itself, it's just computer code. There's lots of nuance to the case. All by itself, it's just computer code, and there's just no real reason to get in the way of, sharing computer instructions like this. However, you have to recognize that at the end of the process, you've printed a deadly weapon. So it's very interesting. It's a very weird piece today of a very weird part of our place in our history. I guess what I was going to say, my unpopular opinion about this thing is nobody's going to want these guns. I really don't think so. There will be a few people by comparison. And because we're a country of 300 million, and I guess a world population well into the billions, some people will want them. There are many of them, but as a percentage of the population or the gun enthusiast population here in the United States, I think it's going to be pretty small. Have you seen them? They're very, very, very stupid looking. I suppose one of the big dangers of it is, of course, I've never seen a working gun more likely to be mistaken for a toy by children than this one. But by the same token, I think that it is also not likely to be terribly popular because it's so awfully stupid looking. It's very clunky, and I think it has to be in order to stand up to the stresses that a working handgun has got to be able to withstand. They're made of metal for a reason. Metal is extraordinarily strong, and it's much stronger than plastic. In order to make a gun that will stand up to the stresses of being fired, it just had to be enormously thick in most of the places. And, so it's a very dumb thing. It's plastic, and so I guess people worry about it being secreted through security, though there are some metal parts, but there might not necessarily be enough metal in it to be picked up by metal detectors, which are of, varying sensitivities, and sometimes you turn them down so you don't get false positives on people's pants, zippers, etc., whatever. So it's very possible that you could sneak them through security in terms of metal detection. The thing is, they're enormously bulky as well. I don't think they're very well concealable. You could put them in a bag or something, but I don't think they're very easy to conceal in your person. They're very dumb looking, and I think just out of curiosity, there will be gun collector types who are like, well, this is a novelty. I'll make one, and there will be weirdo libertarian types who just thrill at the ability to make what is supposed to be a working gun without having to go through the system, whether that's registering their purchase or having their purchase tracked in a federal, because they bought from a federal firearms dealer, a federally licensed firearms dealer, or a background check, or any of those things, or that there be a serial number associated with their gun. It's, I guess, some sort of ultimate libertarian fantasy. The problem is it just doesn't work for the ultimate American gun fantasy. It doesn't look cool. It's a very poor prosthetic penis, as many people, imagine guns to be. It's a very dopey looking thing, and I don't think you gain, I don't see how you gain any, of the respect that people think gun ownership is supposed to bring if you produce one of those things, except among the other kind of people who, for whom this will be a curiosity. Oh, I read about this in the newspaper, and it's frustrating the libs, it's owning the libs that there are such things. So I want one too. And I think people go into it saying, oh, 3D printed at home, that can't cost much. I don't know what it costs to get that much plastic out of one of those 3D printers. They don't, it seems like an enormous amount of material to put into something that's quite honestly pretty dumb. And also, my recollection of it is this has been circulating for some time now, last couple of years. It's only now that the court case is kind of coming to the last stages. And the original, I think there might have been some sort of restraining order about disseminating the instructions, and it's running out. And, the question is whether anyone is going to be able to intervene to continue restraining the distribution of the instructions. At any rate, I just don't see a great future for this particular gun. Now, it may be, there's greater dangers down the road. It may be, and some of them are here right now, too. I mean, one of the great dangers down the road might be advanced plastics available for 3D printers that make it possible to print something that's much more, in its profile is much more like a real gun. That is to say, the ones that everybody thinks are really cool and that you look like a hard guy carrying around. I mean, that's my only definition for it. One of the big difficulties in all these gun debates is the definitions of the weapons and their functionality and appearance, etc. So, I mean, I guess we're at that problem right now in terms of just creating chaos on the streets. Like, you could print a 3D plastic gun that looked real. It just wouldn't fire. And you could cause all sorts of problems with one of those, I suppose. But my recollection is that in the initial test phases, this is the first. People have been trying to do this for some time since there were 3D printers. And this is the first one to successfully produce a weapon that can fire more than a round or two before it just shatters and falls apart. And I don't think it can fire that many. And I think it's designed to take a magazine, but, and therefore fire semi-automatically. However, my recollection is that they can't fire that many rounds. It's not a practical weapon to own for the long term. It's still a novelty, and it still poses some dangers. I mean, people's minds immediately go to the Clint Eastwood In the Line of Fire movie when John Malkovich, his character, made, I think, a ceramic gun for the purpose of getting it through metal detectors at a presidential event and to assassinate the president. That was the idea of the story. And so that raises a lot of concerns. As a single-use weapon, it poses a fairly serious danger in that it will work. I mean, it can fire a bullet or two or 10. It's just not, it's not something you can carry with you every day and practice with at the range, because you'll shatter it at the range before you ever get to use it in real life. If using plastic guns that look like Fisher-Price toys counts as real life for anybody out there. So that's the unpopular opinion about it. This particular gun, I'm actually not that worried about it, because I think it'll be enormously expensive for, I guess you'll pardon the expression, in the bang for the buck category. I think this is a huge loser, and I think that might actually affect what the outcome is when the president, as he said, he's going to very bravely exercise leadership by asking the NRA what to do about this thing. And Michael Musson's comment, to get all the way back to that thing I mentioned like 15 minutes ago, he had said early, before the show, I wonder if the NRA comes out against 3D printed guns because they compete with purchased guns. We're not sure what the NRA is going to say about this thing. And it's possible that they might, go off brand and say, no, we're against this thing. Though I'm sure, obviously then the reason given would not be, because it competes with purchased guns. They don't want anybody to know about that part of their agenda. But this might be an opportunity for them to say, see, we're reasonable. We're not crazy. We just don't want everybody, printing guns and trying them at home without any training. And there's a whole ritual that goes along with becoming a gun owner, including the safety training, which we advocate and sell. And so, we're not particularly enthused about this thing. However, I also think there's a pretty good possibility that they just say, look, there's no First Amendment reason to stop the dissemination of the instructions, and we can't really think of a Second Amendment reason that justifies it either. So no, go ahead. We're against the government getting in the way of responsible firearms owners or responsible firearms printers making their own guns. It may be that they come out that way. And it may be equally driven by the sales question. I don't think, and I don't think they think, that there's going to be enough people that want this stupid looking. I mean, you don't have to print it in blue plastic, as was the case with the picture most recently widely disseminated of one of these guns. I've seen them in other colors. White. I mean, why they don't print them in black plastic, I have no idea. But I guess they want it to be sure that everybody can tell that it's plastic, so they print it in an obviously plastic color, I guess. But anyway, I don't think that the NRA thinks that they're going to cut into sales significantly. And of course, it's just not the kind of gun that, well, it doesn't last. It won't work beyond a couple of shots. So, and that will change, and the design will change, and that's the real danger, is that things will get better in terms of the technology and the strengths of the plastics, and you're able to make these things look a little bit more like the sorts of guns that gun dudes really want. But there is a danger in the 3D printing realm with guns, and it's not really that people are printing the entire guns. It's that they're printing parts for their guns, and that they're able to manufacture parts, which are available on the market and everything. But here's where the real danger of evading serial numbers and tracking of the parts and registration of the weapons in some cases becomes an issue. For instance, in states that have banned high-capacity magazines, it is possible now, and people are doing it, and they will continue to do it, and I haven't seen very much discussion about it. You can 3D print those high-capacity magazines, which you can't otherwise get in your state, and do that without any tracking or detection. And that's problematic. It's really a lot. And they, they don't last a particularly long time, but it's there. You don't have to have it last a long time. It's not the part of the weapon that is meant for long-term durability. It's nice if you can use and reload and reuse the same magazine without spending more money every time you want to load your AR-15 up with 30-plus rounds of ammunition, or 100 rounds in a drum, or whatever you want to do. But that's a bigger danger. Also, the essential component for the construction of an AR-15 type semi-automatic rifle, the weapon, the key component, the receiver, which is sort of the base of the gun and where the rounds move out of the magazine and into the firing mechanism of the gun, etc. Basically the heart of the machinery that makes a gun work. Those are 3D printable too, and or the housing rather that brings it all together and unifies the mechanisms. Those are 3D printable, and that's been sort of on the market for some time too. I don't know how many people love the plastic version of the things, because again, a lot of these gun guys are into the aesthetics of their guns, and having a piece made out of plastic, sometimes not their ideal solution. And also, it still really hasn't caught on very much because, buying the metal ones is not that expensive. And, Not nearly as frustrating, I guess, as waiting for your 3D printer to put this thing out, which is not really going to last a great, any long amount of time anyway, so you might as well buy the metal one. And, of course, there's already programs out there that make it possible to buy AR-15s in parts, none of which have to be, background checked because it's not a working firearm that you're buying. It's just gun parts, and we don't regulate that the same way. And so there are out there, make your own, we've read about it, and also a novelty, make your own AR-15 kits, essentially, and sometimes make your own AR-15 parties where they get 5, 10, 15 people together who are interested in this, and for some cost lower than the retail purchase of an AR-15, you get together with a kit and an instructor and a couple of other like-minded people, and you make a gun yourself out of parts, which in the end gets no serial number because it hasn't been manufactured by a registered manufacturer or sold through federally licensed firearms dealers, etc. So there are bigger dangers out there than this stupid-looking plastic gun. But yes, even this stupid-looking plastic gun could lead to other situations yet to, break through into reality, yet to be realized, which could be the real problem in the end. So I don't know whether that doesn't change my mind about whether or not it's worth fighting the battle now. You might as well, but it also means that should you lose the battle now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the battle couldn't be refought under with a slightly different fact pattern later on, which might present slightly different dangers. Anyway, I think I'm done with the plastic gun issue, but we'll see how this thing develops, and keep an eye on it, I guess, and see whether you think you can envision people walking around with one of those dumb-looking things and acting like a tough guy. I have difficulty envisioning it myself. Now, there's other gun news out there. Yes, right, Timmy Hoover, thanks very much for sending this one over. And I did see one like this yesterday. Oh, I guess I better maybe I could bring up the original report I had come my way via Twitter yesterday, and we can discuss it a little bit just before the break. It's not going to take forever. But an unusual gun fail story out there, not entirely unique necessarily, but it's basically the kind of gun fail story that we are constantly, we always think about, and that gun enthusiasts keep assuring us will never happen. That's, some sort of stupid libtard fantasy. You're making that up, and look, if you're a responsible gun owner, it'll never happen, yada, yada, yada. And, guess what? It happened. And it happened out in Aurora, Colorado. And let's see, where did I get this from? Oh, I didn't link back properly to the person who sent it to me, but I think I can still dig it up. But let me give you the story about the story that would never happen unless it did happen. The news reached Twitter via John Murray, a reporter for the Denver Post, who describes it this way: whoa-level news happening in Aurora. And I'll have to look around. Now I've got another link that's been sent to a actual news story on it. But the breaking news last evening, from Aurora, Colorado, a police officer shoots an armed man at the door of a home. It appears he mistook the guy for a reported intruder, but he instead killed the resident of the home. You see, the resident had already shot the intruder. Here's the story from the Denver Post, now linked to John Murray's tweet. He was a family man, it says here in quotes in the headline. Neighbors react after Aurora police fatally shot resident who killed intruder. You've already imagined the situation. And now you see it unfolding before your eyes, or well, at least the reporting of it unfolding, well, before your ears. The point is, you're hearing about it now. A resident who had just shot and killed an intruder was shot and killed himself by Aurora police early Monday morning. Well, you know what they say about living by the sword. Police were responding to a report of a disturbance when they shot the armed man at his residence, Aurora police said in a Monday afternoon news release. Neighbors described the man shot by the officer as a longtime resident, grandfather, and retired family man. Well, he was retired, and he was a family man. He was still a family man. He hadn't retired from his family, I don't think. Anyway, he often tended to his front gardens. What a pleasant fellow. His name was not released on Monday. The shooting incident is being investigated by the Aurora Police Major Crimes Unit with the Denver Police Department as well. State law requires law enforcement agencies to team up with neighboring agencies to investigate officer-involved shootings, according to the news release. I didn't know that. The officer-involved shooting happened at about 1:30 a.m. at, now, if they're not going to release the guy's name, why would you? No. All right. Well, look, what can I tell you? The Denver Post made this editorial decision. We'll go along with it. 10609 East Montview Boulevard, police said. So given that information, you can probably find out who was tending the gardens there. At that time, Aurora dispatchers had received multiple 911 calls about a disturbance in the area. Dispatchers also received a 911 call from a woman at the address who said a man was breaking into the home, police said. Police described the scene as chaotic. Got a little more chaotic once they arrived. Upon arriving, officers heard gunshots fired from inside the home and encountered an armed man, police said. An officer fired his gun, hitting the man, who turned out to be a resident. He was taken to a local hospital where he later died. And so there you have it. I mean, I got to wrap this up before we get out for the break. I don't know that you need any more details than that, but we'll probably discuss it just a little bit more. We knew it was coming, and here it is. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Networks Radio. And, here's a comment from Ricky here. The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, unless the cops get called, and then everybody's toast. That's basically where we are on this one. Yes, it's true. It sounds like, as I skim a little bit forward, I mean, I don't want to cheat here. We'll share all the news with you in just a second, but I peeked just a little bit during the break, even though I spent most of the break running to the refrigerator hoping for some iced coffee. Anyway, there's clearly something going on in the home here that makes me suspect that this isn't, I don't know, for lack of a better term, a pure, random intruder story. Like it might be someone who was known to them, you know what I mean? Or perhaps even another family member with whom they were not getting along, maybe a custody battle or something of the sort. Every time we get around to describing the intruder, it is enclosed in scare quotes. And I'm not really sure why that is. And then, of course, they keep describing the person who shot the, quote, intruder and then was shot by the police. I was going to say, quote, police, but they're real police. They really do this. Usually, I think the construction of the sentence and the story as you would otherwise imagine it calls for, saying that this guy is the homeowner. It's interesting that they don't say that. And I mean, it could be, a rental. obviously there's that. Or, the home is owned by someone else and someone else lives there. There's a lot of residents there, but just describing him as a resident is a little stilted and weird. But the rest of this story, we'll continue on with it. Maybe you'll see what I mean. Maybe you'll disagree, but... police described the scene as chaotic. I think we all agreed about that. Upon arriving, officers heard the gunshots from inside the home and encountered an armed man, police said. An officer fired his gun, hitting the man who turned out to be a resident. You know what I mean? It's kind of weird. He was taken to a local hospital where he later died. After the resident was shot, officers went inside the home and found an injured juvenile and a dead man police described as an, quote, intruder, unquote, who was down on a bathroom floor. The injured juvenile was taken to a local hospital with serious injuries caused by the intruder. Okay, so now a scene is unfolding. Is it a random cat burglar who decides to turn into an elephant burglar? I don't know. I thought I said cat burglar, and I thought that the purpose of those guys was to sneak in, sneak out, cause no problems, and this guy obviously didn't do that. Was it, they mentioned that this is the resident who was shot by police was a grandfather, for one thing, and a avid gardener, for another. I don't really know why that necessarily got involved in the story, but I'm wondering if there's a juvenile in the home, a resident in the home, is that the grandchild? And if, by some chance, is the intruder like dad from whom the kids have been removed for some reason and he shouldn't have been there, or he's abusive to the kids? I don't know. I'm beginning to think that there might be some backstory to this. Our preliminary investigation has revealed the deceased intruder on the bathroom floor was fatally shot by the armed adult male resident, police said. Again, stilted terminology, but now it's just maybe just because police are talking, and police love that stuff. I don't know why. Neighbors along the busy stretch of Montview Boulevard did not realize the longtime resident had been killed by a police officer until news reports were released late Monday afternoon. It's sad and screwed up, said Brad Maestas. I don't know how he pronounces his name. Sorry, Brad. Maestas, who has known the family for 34 years. 34 point something years. Maestas heard gunshots that woke him, and he first thought someone was trying to break into his house. Oh my gosh. You can see how the scene could be chaos. There's bullets flying all over the neighborhood. Dogs are awake. They're barking everywhere. People are shooting at nothing, at phantoms, bullets flying into one another's homes. Anyway, yeah, and because guess what he does? Because he's also in Aurora, Colorado. Maestas heard gunshots that woke him, and he first thought someone was trying to break into his house with a gun. Bang, bang. I'm trying to, like Bugs Bunny, I'm going to shoot an outline of myself into the wall and then push it in. Why? I don't know. Whatever. People, that's the problem with guns, is that every time somebody hears something, they think somebody's breaking into their house. Lots of people feel that way, but only gun people start firing out into the night as a result. Maestas, as surely as the sun did rise, he grabbed a gun, but he put it away when he saw all of the police cars swarming around his neighbor's home. And a good thing, too, because there was a cop out there that would shoot anybody with a gun. So good thinking, Brad. He saw paramedics take his neighbor away on a gurney. He was trying to cope with the trauma and care for his mother, who lives with him. She's a resident in the home, you see. He was a family man, a grandpa that was protecting his family, Maestas said. It's messed up. And he surely was. It just didn't work out very well in the end. No fault of his own, I guess, except maybe, I don't know, maybe it is. Maybe he didn't do enough to put away the gun when the police arrived. But that's adrenaline for you. Susan Askoul, Askoul, met the family when she moved back to her childhood home to care for her aging mother. Everybody's got a story. Nobody just lives there. Everybody's got a very long story about how they got there or returned there, or they're a resident here, and are you a gardener and a grandfather? Interesting. It's the human interest angle on the story. I don't blame anybody here, but She met the family when she moved back to her childhood home to care for her aging mother. I don't know whether Brad moved back to his childhood home or moved there and then mom moved in. Who knows what the story is? Not central to the narrative here. She said she got to know the family at the funeral of another longtime neighborhood resident who presumably died of natural causes. The man who was killed by police was retired and spent hours tending to flowers in his yard, neighbors said. He also sometimes took care of his neighbor's yard, and he would call if he noticed something or someone out of place at her home. We all kind of look out for each other, she said. Comes with the gun thing. I bought a gun, I'm going to make my family safe, and I might as well make the community and the neighborhood safe, just so long as I don't decide to clean the thing and do so while it's still loaded and fire accidentally into my neighbor's house, but that happens a lot too. Neighbors were waiting for more information from police on the intruder. Who was he? Why would he have burst into their retired neighbor's home in the middle of the night? He could have picked my house, Askell said. That's people justifying their own weapons ownership. And, of course, we don't know, and I guess we won't know from this story, but my guess is that, no, he wouldn't have picked your house. It was a targeted incident. And, no, that doesn't mean you should buy another gun because that thing happened next door to you. Unless, of course, you, too, are involved in a family dispute of a similar nature. But, hey, it could happen to anyone, but I bet it wasn't random. I might be wrong, but that's my guess. The name of the intruder also not released on Monday. And why protect the identity of the intruder unless it's a family situation? The officer who fired has been placed on administrative reassignment with pay, per department policy. This is a very heartbreaking and tragic situation for everyone involved, Chief Nick Metz said in a written statement. The 17th Judicial District Attorney's Office is also involved in the ongoing investigation. So that's the sum total of the story filed yesterday, though updated to this morning at 6:35 a.m. by Kieran Nicholson and Noel Phillips of the Denver Post. I don't know if there's going to be any more updated information circulating just yet. But, well, I can take a peek around. We did get a message from Timmy Hoover, as I mentioned, sending us the ABC News story out of ABC News Fresno. Interesting enough. Everybody's going to be interested in this story. We'll see whether they have any further information on this thing. When was their story published? Oh, it comes with some autoplaying video. Updated 54 minutes ago. Let's just take a quick scan and see whether we've learned anything else. Not so far. Nope. No additional information. But thank you for sending the story along. Just in case, since it was filed this morning, you never know. Tim, thanks for trying to keep us up to date. Let's see. Back to the other strange gun story, the plastic one. Let's see. Comment here from Warfare _class, who says of the plastic gun issue out on Twitter, this is strictly a libertarian publicity stunt to own the big government regulators. And that's pretty much, I think, exactly what's going on with the plastic gun story. What else have we got here? Ricky with another comment. In my experience, when something like that happens, the people who talk to reporters only want to get their mugs on TV. Yeah, that's possibly true. The neighbors. So they're all telling their stories. I think this was a printed report, of course, and there were no photos accompanying the story of the neighbors, though that sometimes happens too. But yeah, people want to be on record, and I don't know. I think they want to express their shock and dismay and all. And the reporters are just trying to put a human face on the story, almost in interestingly, a twist similar to what the residents were saying. This could have happened to anybody. This could happen anywhere. It's a tragedy that we need to be aware of. And I don't even know where the reporters are necessarily coming from in all of this. It could very well be that they say, this is one of the dangers of widespread gun ownership. You think you're protecting the family with your gun ownership, and I guess in a sense, if everything goes right, I guess you are. The issue is, will everything go right? In so many ways for it to go wrong, including, like I said, accidentally shooting yourself while you're waiting for something like this could happen. to happen. Accidentally shooting a neighbor when you clean the gun in preparation for such an event, should it ever happen. Of course, there's also the old break-in and you fire and miss and hit somebody else, like perhaps your own family members or neighbors, or shooting, reporting an intruder and there is no intruder and the police arrive and you accidentally shoot the police. Any number of things that can go wrong, and this is just one of dozens. So anyway, that's basically how that story stands. Lots of people still commenting out in the general interwebs about the plastic gun thing, and it's an interesting theory out there. I think maybe the applied gun fail that we read about out of Aurora is perhaps more interesting and certainly more widespread than plastic gun ownership is likely to be in the near future, especially when it comes to this particularly stupid-looking gun. All right. Lots of other things happening here. Maybe we can make the shift toward economic issues and away from gun issues, even though gun issues could encompass Maria Butina, if you really wanted to bring a few things in there. You know what? As a matter of fact, maybe we'll top that one off with a story from the New York Times on Butina that we didn't get to share the other day. There was a hard news story, I guess you would call it, about her participation in the National Prayer Breakfast that we discussed yesterday. But Catherine Stewart over at the New York Times had also filed an opinion piece on the subject. It added a slightly different angle, and I thought I might share it with you if it's not all that long. And then we'll make our segue over to the economics for the day. What was Maria Butina doing at the National Prayer Breakfast? And the answer is crime. That's what you do at National Prayer Breakfasts. America's Christian nationalists have been finding common cause with the Russian government for a while now. And that also fits in with our theme of, hey, look out, there might be something more to this than just hating gay people, loving guns, and wanting to be able to manipulate an American president. Does it seem strange that, according to a criminal complaint unsealed on Monday by the Justice Department, a Russian woman stands accused of, quote, acting as an agent of a foreign government, unquote, in part because she hoped, quote, a lot of quotes here, to establish a back channel of communication, unquote, with American politicians at the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington. Well, it shouldn't. And here, in the opinion piece, is where they finally give credit to Jeff Sharlet. Credit that as far as I could tell, they denied him in the hard news story. In other words, hey, we just found out this whole crazy thing about the National Prayer Breakfast. We found out about it because someone else did all the research and we read it. But we won't tell you that. Of course, the difference between them and me is I tell you who did that research. I grab credit for reading it to you, but the New York Times is in the business of not giving other people credit. All right, so does it sound like a surprise? Are you surprised about Butina at the National Prayer Breakfast and establishing a back channel? Well, you shouldn't be, because as Jeff Sharlet, an associate professor of English at Dartmouth, has pointed out, the National Prayer Breakfast has long offered a backdoor to American power. And that's a quote, too. I forgot to say quote and unquote. A backdoor to American power. And America's homegrown Christian nationalists have evinced an admiration for Russia's authoritarian leader that appears to have grown apace with his brutality. On Tuesday, and that would have been some past Tuesday, I think this date on this piece is July 18th. But on the Tuesday prior, I guess, Maria Butina, a 29-year-old Russian whose name was spelled Maria with two I's in court papers, and it's starting to look like that was just a typo, was indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of conspiracy and acting as an unregistered foreign agent for the Russian Federation. I think for a while that misspelling got repeated and everybody thought, I don't know, Russian. Maybe they used two I's. I don't think so. According to the complaint unsealed on Monday, Ms. Butina's promotional activities for Russian political interests included attending the National Prayer Breakfast twice. The National Prayer Breakfast was initiated in 1953, we know this from Jeff, by a Methodist minister, Abraham Vereide, I don't know how he pronounces that name, Vereide, who had been leading congressional prayer groups for a decade. The annual breakfast now attracts close to 4,000 participants, that's a lot of eggs, and is hosted by members of Congress. But the real force behind the event remains Mr. Vereide's, Fellowship Foundation, also known as the Family, whose fundamental mission is to create a ruling consortium of Christ-centered political and community leaders. It's not working very well, but they're very self-centered, but they like to blame it all on Christ. So, in that sense, I guess something's happening. The Family considers National Prayer Breakfast, the National Prayer Breakfast here hashtagged in the sentence, a recruiting device. Mr. Charlotte, who has published 2 books about the group, tweeted on Monday. Lobbyists and foreign governments look forward to the event as a way to meet powerful people without, as Mr. Charlotte has reported, having to go through the State Department and normal vetting processes, because you can't vet prayer, right? It's not just the breakfast. The Family organizes a week of de facto lobbying events, Mr. Charlotte explained on Twitter. We read those tweets, of course, out in the wild before they were compiled for us in the New York Times. Hashtag Maria Butina used them to maximize impact. On October 5th, 2016, with one National Prayer Breakfast under her belt, Ms. Butina direct messaged, get it, a Russian official on Twitter. We made our bet. I am following our game. I don't really know what that's supposed to mean. I will be connecting the people from the prayer breakfast to this group. After the election, Ms. Butina informed someone the complaint called Ms. Butina informed someone the complaint called U.S. person number 1, remember that whole thing, that she would be bringing along some very, and that's in capital letters, very influential Russians to the breakfast. After the event, which President Trump attended, just as previous presidents have, Ms. Butina emailed one of its organizers to thank him for, quote, the gift, unquote, of his, quote, precious time during the National Prayer Breakfast Week and for the very private meeting that followed. A new relationship between 2 countries always begins better when it begins in faith, unquote. And, of course, that actually would be a pretty damning sentence in the trial for whether or not she's an unregistered agent. If she's just, hey, I just like to, meet Americans and have Americans meet Russians, it's interesting that you frame it in the in this way, that a new relationship between 2 countries. Who are you establishing relationships between 2 countries? Unless you are a foreign agent of that country, you've got no business even, imagining that that's what you're doing. But it was, because you are an unregistered foreign agent. Anyway, it should also not be surprising, she says, that at least some in the breakfast crowd were positively disposed to the Russian visitors. The bond between America's Christian nationalists and the Russian government goes back a long way, long before anyone conceived of the possibility of a Trump administration. Paul Weyrich belongs on any short list of the individuals who created the religious right as we know it today, and hairs on the back of your neck should stand up when you hear his name. He was a central figure in the founding of numerous conservative organizations, including the Heritage Foundation, ALEC, the Moral Majority, and the Council for National Policy. In the 1970s, Mr. Weyrich was one of the strategists who first conceived of outreach to evangelical churches in order to recruit activists to socially conservative causes. He was also among the first to grasp the potential for an alliance with religious conservatives in Russia and Eastern Europe. Rather, something of a visionary there. A weirdo and deservedly hated figure, but visionary nonetheless. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Mr. Weyrich made dozens of trips to Russia, eventually becoming a strong supporter of closer relations. By the time of his death, in 2008, Mr. Weyrich was writing and speaking frequently in defense of Russia and facilitating visits between American conservatives and Russian political leaders. Another religious conservative who pursued the Russian connection was Brian Brown, president of the National Organization for Marriage. What a flop. In 2013, Mr. Brown testified before the Duma, Russia's lower house of parliament, in support of legislation opposing adoption by gay couples. What I realized was that there was a great change happening in the former Soviet Union, Mr. Brown told the Washington Post. There was a real push to reinstill Christian values in the public square. Well, there was a real push to reinstill values allowing for visceral hatred, in particular of LGBTQ community members, that, was adequately covered by what they called Christian conservatism. I don't know if that's really what was going on, but maybe. But interesting that he would be testifying before the Duma at all. I wonder whether they even bothered to use the cover of the idea of, I mean, it's interesting because I would now tie it to the Magnitsky Act, if only this way. This might really actually have had something to do with adoptions. Adopting kids out of the former Soviet Union became something of a bonanza in the early post-Soviet days. One, because the post-Soviet privatizers and oligarchs realized there was a tremendous amount of money to be made in trafficking the kids, sort of. And most of the adoptions were indeed just straight up legitimate adoptions. I don't think the majority of it was trafficking per se, but I mean in the sense that they privatized the publicly run Soviet era orphanages, essentially, and made a pretty penny with processing fees getting these kids adopted. It didn't, I don't think, result in a whole lot of oligarchs emerging out of the adoption business, but I think a considerable amount of money changed hands. But there was a huge demand all of a sudden. When the Soviet Union fell, it took a little while to discover this, but and here's good old American racism and race awareness creeping up into this too. There's really sort of a weird toxic brew, I guess, around unexpected elements of the privatization of post-Soviet Russia here. What I'm saying is, once the Soviet Union fell and Russia, sort of reemerged into unrestricted trade type relationships with Western countries, no longer boycotting them or sufficiently suspicious of Russians now that they were post-Soviet and thrown off the Soviet yoke. Russia, for adoption interested couples in the United States, what Russia was a then untapped bonanza of white babies and children available for adoption. That being apparently something of a shortage of that in the United States. And I guess what a weird situation that is, just in terms of describing as a shortage is really kind of like stomach turning on a number of levels. Mostly because it's like, well, you want to be, adoption is such a sensitive issue. I don't even really want to get into it, but on the one hand, it's weird. Like if you want to take care of a child who has nothing, then do it. But on the other hand, for familial relations, I guess I shouldn't be too judgmental about wanting to have to adopt somebody into your family that looks and feels like somebody that you would naturally have, had born into your family. I don't know if it's I know it isn't entirely fair to criticize that, although there's also some part of me that says, if you want to share your life with a child who needs help, that is a great thing. There are plenty of them, and some who need considerably more help. And I don't know, it was weird, like the idea of going around the world looking for somebody who might be white enough for you is kind of icky, I guess. And I'd rather think of the thousands, millions. I don't know how many people have been involved in adoptions of foreign kids in the last couple of years, but I know so many people who who really did do something like that and said, well, okay, there aren't as many kids available for adoption here in the United States, and there are kids in need all around the world. And I mean, adoptions from China were huge too. And, so thankfully, I guess the redeeming factor, there's still, great human beings in the world, even here in America, and they're adopting children of all races and all colors from all around the world. But there was a very weird boomlet of Russian adoptions. And that's, I guess, I wondered whether Brian Brown used that or whether the Duma and the Christian conservatives, or whatever they would really call themselves over there in the Duma, were savvy enough to use that as cover. Well, we'll have this guy testify on adoption by gay couples in America in order to have us ban allowing gay couples in America to adopt Russian children, or whether they were just outright like, I don't know, we'll ban adoption by gay couples here in Russia too, and here's an American expert on how to lobby against that and to tell us what sort of language we can use to disguise the true depth of our bitterness and hatred. Whether he was really just a political consultant giving them socially acceptable terminology to use for opposing gay adoptions anywhere, including here in Russia, or whether he was just visiting as an interested party from the United States. Hey, I hate gay people in the United States, and you can help me hate them over there by enacting this law, which you won't even be particularly opposed to because you hate gay and lesbian people as well. And so, we should get together on this thing. I'm a little bit curious about that. Of course, that's not the main thrust of the story, and the main thrust of the story is yet to come. We can share it after this break, and then we'll be in the 10 o'clock hour, and I know that Ian is ready and waiting. We can have him join us soon. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's wrap things up about Butina and just stay on focus with the story here. Stop spinning off into other threads of the story. Joining the National Organization for Marriage in the budding alliance with the Russians were a number of other religious right groups, including the activist groups International Organization of the Family, also directed by Mr. Brown. So I guess that wasn't really a hard choice, was it? And Family Watch International, an Arizona-based group that promotes an anti-LGBT and anti-abortion agenda around the world. They are fun, aren't they? In 2016, the World Congress of Families, how do you like that? A group that formed in Russia in 1997 held an event in Tbilisi, the capital of the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. Participants cast President Vladimir Putin's Russia and the Orthodox Church as defenders of Christian civilization against a secular, decadent West. And of course, the most secular organization, secular country around, actually at that time, and just prior to it, I guess, would have been the Soviet Russians. But hey, never mind that. The stupid, decadent West is the real problem. Okay, well, they had to ditch that language later on, I guess, in order to make an alliance with us. In the run-up to the 2016 election, the passion for Russian values, really, among America's religious extremists grew still more ardent. In 2013, Brian Fisher, then a spokesman for the American Family Association, called Mr. Putin a, quote, lion of Christianity. I bet he is lying about it. In 2014, Franklin Graham, the politically influential evangelist and vocal Trump supporter, defended Mr. Putin for his efforts to, quote, protect his nation's children from the damaging effects of any gay and lesbian agenda, unquote, also by kissing them on the belly. Even as he lamented that Americans have, quote, abdicated our moral leadership, unquote. I'm sick and tired of these guys bad-mouthing America. I don't know. I might be able to run on that platform. In December of 2015, Mr. Graham met privately with Mr. Putin for 45 minutes. He kissed him on the belly, too. It's really a weird thing, and not many photographs of him kissing Franklin Graham on the belly. Although the religious right's affection for Mr. Putin appears to center on a shared disgust with, quote, the homosexual agenda, unquote, and other so-called family issues, it is impossible to overlook the attraction that the Russian leader's authoritarian style has for many of his American admirers. During the 2016 presidential campaign, Mike Pence hailed Mr. Putin as a stronger leader in his country than Barack Obama has been in this country. The attraction appears to be mutual, even if it's almost certainly not symmetrical. More than 50 Russians attended the most recent national prayer breakfast in February. At the same time that it has been infiltrating the political system of the United States, the Russian government has sought to cultivate and influence far-right groups in Europe. It turns out that anti-LGBT politics are an effective tool in mobilizing religious nationalists everywhere, which is in turn an excellent way to destabilize the Western alliance and advance Russia's geopolitical interests. Anti-LGBT politics are in this respect no different from the gun rights advocacy, and that's enclosed in scare quotes too, that Ms. Butina is accused of using to build a bridge between Russian and American leaders via the National Rifle Association. No serious observer believes that Mr. Putin cares a fig about our Second Amendment or the rest of the Constitution. For him, America's fabled gun culture is just a weakness to be exploited for the sake of Russia's national interest. And I think they have it right there. Which really ought to give pause to those who imagine that Russia is sincere in its supposed desire to unite with America's religious conservatives over a putatively shared variety of Christian values. Why would anyone assume, this is a good point too, that Mr. Putin means what he says about spiritual matters? The religious right thinks that it's using Mr. Putin to advance its aims, but a far more plausible interpretation is that he is using the religious right to infiltrate, divide, and weaken our country. And Catherine Stewart, I think you've got it right. You could tell her that on Twitter if you want. She's Kath Stewart. There's two S's in there. Kath S. Stewart, I guess. Middle initial in there. Not Catherine S. Stewart, not Kathy S. Stewart. Kath S. Stewart. Also, by the way, it says here, the author of The Good News Club, The Christian Right's Stealth Assault on America's Children. And I guess we better read up on that because there's some very clear assaults on America's children, not so stealthy, going on elsewhere in the news today. However, it's time for our segue over to what I had held out as the economic section of our show. And we're going to engineer our call and call our favorite professor. We rate him very highly on, what do they rate professors on? Not Yelp, but I'm sure he knows. Ian Reifowitz. We'll give him a call. He's got, as I mentioned, his latest Sunday piece about the previous round of Trump tax plans and what a sham it all turned out to be. And of course, those of us listening knew that it was one, just as as we were working on it, as we were watching it flow through. And okay, heads up, thumbs up from Ian here. Let me give him a call. Going to have to engineer it on the newer computer, a computer we've bought since we spoke to him last, you see. So we have to make sure that his name is properly plugged in here. All right, let's give it a go. And see if this works. Okay, can we make the call? All right, coming in. Let's see. Yeah, I'm going to have to type them and then hit the buttons. And let's get a ringy-dingy going here. All right, Ian, let's get down to it. Good morning, Ian.
David, hello.
Hey, long time well, we never really did see each other though you can over Skype. No, long time no speak. How are you, Ian?
I'm doing okay. I'm going to apologize before even asking how you are. I'm going to apologize if I'm a bit loopy this morning.
Oh.
I did another interview earlier on with the French news channel in English, thankfully, about Trump and Manafort, and so I've been up since 4, which is generally a little earlier than I like to arise. So yes. If I'm a little loopy, that's a reason, not an excuse.
I see. Okay.
But how are you, David?
I'm loopy. I didn't even speak to anybody else but that's just normal for me. I got up at the same time, and I'm just normally loopy. So that's fine. It'll work out very well. How's France? They're doing okay?
They seem to be fine
All
from
right.
what I saw via Skype.
Okay. So, a small window, literally, in on France. Okay. Well, I'm a little curious. What do they care? What do they want to know about Trump now? Is there something that was not clear to them?
Well, I mean, this is like an English language sort of, international news channel that's run out of France. So they are all over the world. And they wanted to talk about Manafort and the trial, which obviously is something we're all, thinking about, and how it might get how a guilty plea could be leveraged that by Mueller to get Manafort to tell him where the bodies are buried regarding the Trump and the collusion that's not a crime, or whatever you want to call it.
Yes. Okay. And I imagine, if they have listeners all over the world, many of them would have been Manafort's clients, so they might be interested in finding out what he might reveal about them in court.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, good for them for trying to keep up. I had mentioned to everyone at the start of the show there's a lot of news happening around the subject that you shared with us in your last Sunday essay on Daily Kos, and that's going to be the focus of things today. Although, again, as always, you're free to roam wherever the conversation takes us. But I thought this one was interesting just because it seemed to me to be the subject being taxes and the Trump tax cut, a little bit outside of where I usually find the subjects I usually find you writing about, although, not by any means out of character, but an interesting choice of subject. The piece was titled, "Trump Tax Plan Was a Lie," and there I find no surprise that you'd be writing about that. Corporate tax revenue at a 75-year low, and that's important news. 2019 deficit looks like $1 trillion, and probably even more, and only set to grow. This is not the usual subject that we talk about with you, but a real interesting one. And actually, I'm curious what motivated you to take that one up. I mean, besides the fact that it was an outrageous lie and the thing was structured to fail from a traditional economics standpoint, and that all by itself is outrageous. But I guess considering the many outrages that you could have picked up, why this one?
Well, there's a little bit, I'll have to admit, a little bit of chance that once, sort of strikes a person's fancy when you're talking about writing a weekly column, as I do now. But, what strikes me is about Trump and his whole presidency. Well, there are a number of things that strike me, and obviously some of it are the issues that you and I normally talk about, issues of race baiting or racial identity in a diverse society, and how, one party, the Democrats, talk about inclusion and equality, and the other, let's say, does not. And Trump is certainly guiltier of that than any president we've had in quite a long time, and really any major political figure, at least going back to George Wallace. But it's not the only thing he does. And I mean, to connect it all, what all of his race baiting is a way of winning votes, and this is consistent with some of the things that many Republicans have done, although certainly not all, and not all to the same degree. But what he's done is he race baits because it's a way of getting voters to identify with him and to identify with what he's doing, and to believe that he's on their side because he's really not, when you look at their pocketbook issues, right? Yes. And so it all connects. And I in the post, I close with a quote from Lyndon Johnson, which I've always found to be a really fascinating one. And I'm going to try to get it up here again, even though I closed my browser. Sorry about that. But okay. It's Lyndon Johnson talking about, quote unquote working class whites, those famous, he doesn't use a phrase, but those famous working class whites, and how racial resentment is the easiest way for Republicans to win their votes without having to actually give them anything, of actual value. And so the quote is from Johnson: "If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on, and he'll empty his pockets for you." And I think that's pretty apt. The language is a little outdated, but the sentiments are apt. And so that's what Trump has done with his tax cut. He campaigns by, with his, I don't even want to say barely coded, his open white identity politics. And he talks about, in terms of economics, what he's going to do for, working class people. So he says, but when he gets into office, what does he do? He initiates a huge tax cut, Republican orthodoxy, that throws a few pennies to those in the middle class, but showers most of the benefits to those at the top and also to corporations who use it to not create jobs, not increase wages, but buy back shares of their own companies, which of course benefits shareholders. And who are the shareholders? Again, the top 10% in terms of wealth own almost 9/10 of all shares of stock. So it's all money that's being vacuumed up the economic ladder. It's the opposite of trickle-down economics. And I believe I think Hillary Clinton even used this phrase when she talked about trickle-up economics. And I don't want to say what's worse, because I'll talk about all the things that are bad about this. So it sucks money up the economic ladder, which increases economic inequality and allows the wealthy to have even more wealth and thus use that wealth to entrench their power in the political system, and that feeds on itself. A. B, in order to do that, we're now faced with a choice: borrow more money, which of course puts the government further in debt, and then C, they can use that increased debt, they being Republicans, to argue for cutting spending. Yes. Cutting spending on the social safety net, cutting spending for, and here you link it back to the race baiting, cutting spending on quote unquote dependent people. We want to, they don't, they can talk about people who really don't want to work. And if you go down to some of the other people, whether it's media folks like Limbaugh or even some of these representatives who talk about people who are lazy, and that's all code, and welfare, that's all code for those black people. So again, it's all about race baiting. Talking about welfare distracts the people who are Trump voters, who are middle class or working class Trump voters, probably almost all white, distracts them from the fact that their money and the money of the Treasury is being sent to millionaires, people like Trump. So all of these things connect. The race baiting, the trickle-up economics are ways for a candidate and a president to win the votes of people who he's not helping one iota in material terms.
Well, okay, agreed. We're done. That pretty much wraps it up. But yeah, it is astounding. And of course, the rhetoric continues. And I've been, all of us have, of course, been upset by it, but also poking fun at it all along, because there's nothing else you could do, I guess, to keep from crying about it. All the various policies that have absolutely nothing to do with one of the biggest topics of his rallies and his campaign stops, bringing back manufacturing jobs, coal mining jobs, which was perhaps a ridiculous thing to even hint at. And I think even the coal miners knew it at the time, but they didn't care because he tells it like it is when it comes to being racist. I am racist, so is he. And he's telling that like it is, and I enjoy that, and it's fun. Also like beating up hippies, and he says that's okay to do here at the rally too. So it's pretty good, even if none of us really believe our jobs are coming back. And I suppose if you're really the kind of person that for whatever reason now all of a sudden has started deciding to believe politicians because Donald Trump is one and he says things that you wish were true, there's plenty of fodder out there to keep you going from day to day, because whether or not those jobs are coming back, Trump is announcing left and right that they are, so you can always point to that and say, the president says it, so it must be so. We've all been trained to believe that's the case. And now we have 7 U.S. steel plants opening up anew, and all sorts of manufacturing plants being opened, jobs growing like crazy, and coal jobs coming back, even though the statistics say no, and none of the people I know that work in these industries have any of these jobs. But I'm told it happens, and I guess it just sort of enters the realm of urban legend. And if it keeps you buying Make America Great Again hats and voting Trump, I guess he's satisfied, and to some extent so are these guys too. They never really thought they were going to get anything out of it. They're not, but it's also still, I guess they think, okay to be racist now, even though they keep one at a time getting caught on videotape and losing the jobs that they had or thought were coming back thanks to Trump. It's a very weird situation we find ourselves in, but like you said, entirely predictable, predicted outright by Lyndon Johnson years ago, back in the days when Trump was just a kid avoiding the draft.
Exactly. And the other part I forgot about is that he promised, in terms of the tax cuts, he promised that they would pay for themselves, right?
Yes,
that's the old voodoo economics. And that was the point of the data that came out over the past couple of weeks, is that they're not paying for themselves. The deficit is going through the roof because corporate tax receipts are at a 75-year low. Corporations are hugely profitable, but the amount of taxes they're paying into the government has dropped. Why? Because you cut the rates. Well, Of course, if you cut the rates, they're going to pay in less in revenue. But the Republican claim has always been, well, that there'll be so much growth that it'll be a smaller share of a bigger pie. Well, that's not happening. That was the other point, is that the promise made by Trump that these would pay for themselves, the tax cuts for the rich would pay for themselves, is not happening. And in terms of the voters, look, it's almost the sort of the flip side of I feel your pain. I mean, he said to these coal miners, I feel your pain, right? It's not only about racial resentment. It's also just about this idea that he sold them a bill of goods, that he cares about them. Part of it is he cares about them in terms of a white identity politics aspect, but then also this idea that he cares about them as coal miners, and they bought into it. And I think this sort of goes to a larger question, and this might connect to some of the things we've talked about in the past, which is this whole question of identity. I think it's not helpful or productive in terms of progressive politics, or even in terms of sort of larger questions of our culture and our society, to think of these voters as think of white American voters as either quote unquote racist or quote unquote not racist, right? I think it's more a matter of what resentments do they have, what aspects of racism do they have in their mindset, and what brings them out, in particular on Election Day. Some of the same people, obviously, who voted for Barack Obama voted for Donald Trump. So to think about those people as being racist or not racist is less important than thinking about, well, why did these people who were willing to vote for a racist in 2016 also vote for Barack Obama in 2008 or 2012? And what can we do to get them to vote again for a Democrat in 2020? So it's not about turning them from a racist into not racist. It's more a matter of getting them to, getting them to think about something other than their racial identity when they actually step into the voting booth. And we need to be able to do that by emphasizing what we will do for them as a party, and also by emphasizing our values, because that's really an important thing. Values of fairness, values of not to mention truth and honesty, but values of economic fairness really matter. Do you want to have a system where all the wealth goes to the people at the top? Is that fair? Does that provide equality of opportunity? Does that provide anybody below the top couple of percent opportunity? Well, no. That's an argument Democrats can make to people who maybe on their worst days are going to vote for somebody who's appealing to their racial interests, but on their better days might vote for somebody like a Barack Obama or somebody else who shares most of the same views as Obama did.
Very possibly. I'm starting to think as you're speaking about it, I try not to credit the Trump himself, certainly, or even the people very close to him, with any kind of strategic ability. But occasionally you do wonder. about whether or not there's the spark of strategic ability in there somewhere. And certainly people whose job it is to think about the politics on his behalf fancy themselves strategists. And I guess I was wondering whether it's almost as though over the past couple of years, and especially since his election, with all the it almost seems like a coordinated effort to make open racism acceptable again in some way. Whether the thinking was, well, yeah, there are some number of people anyway, and perhaps a significant number who once voted for Barack Obama, now voting for Trump, and who made that transition under the guise of being, I guess, economically anxious. And there certainly is a great amount of economic anxiety out there, but of course, it's been somewhat conflated. But maybe it was purposely conflated with the racial resentment, with the idea being, in other words, in order to prevent these people from reverting back to their better nature and voting on pocketbook issues without regard to, at least to the race of the candidate at a minimum, maybe we need to cultivate an atmosphere in which racism and racial resentment held out openly is acceptable again, or at least not the risk it used to be. And that way it can overcome any appeals to the economic message that might be offered by Democrats later. I mean, once you've tasted the racism, you'll stay. You won't go back. Come for the economic anxiety, but stay for the racism. Maybe that will work. I don't know if that's a wise strategy or if it's any kind of strategy at all. But it's the only thing I can think of that seems to fit the facts of significant numbers of people having voted for Barack Obama and then saying, the hell with it, I'll try the complete opposite.
Right. Look, I mean, I don't want to try to get into Trump's head. Right? I mean, I think
there's plenty of room.
Yeah. Good point. I think he ran a completely id
yes,
driven campaign. He has a lifetime of expressing racial resentment. He has a lifetime of discriminating in his business practices. I think he is what he is, and that's the only way he knows how to be. I don't think he ever intended to become president. I think he just started running and couldn't shift gears, or wasn't going to shift gears once he got started, because his whole point was to craft some kind of presence in the media based on his personality. Mm-hmm. Steve Bannon, I think, fit that beautifully for him, and said something that I think Democrats need to remember, which is that, and I don't remember the exact quote, but Bannon basically said every day that the political debate is about race and identity is a good day for Republicans. And so I think, having found himself in the White House, he's, yes, he right, still can't change who he is or what he is, but the people doing the thinking for him, whether it's people like Bannon, who I still think he probably draws some degree on, but Bannon's sort of younger alter ego, younger and balder alter ego, Stephen Miller, right?
Yes.
He's got the same idea. And in terms of politics, he knows he can't win in a landslide. He knows that he can probably not even win the popular vote, but he drew an inside straight, and the only way he can draw another inside straight is to hold on to that base, that white working class base, and as much of the rest of the white population as he can. I mean, my God, was that an inside straight? I mean, you probably talked about this a million times, but the idea of losing the popular vote by 3 million and squeaking out 3 states to just put him over the top.
Yes.
This is not you don't plan a campaign to win that way unless you have no other possible way of winning. Yeah. And that's what he does, and that's where he's at. But I do think that he is what he is. And if he had lost, he would have remained what he is. And certainly once he's won, he's not going to change because, hey, I won. Why would I change? That was sorry,
exactly. Well, it's a temptation for everyone. I guess, let's see. One of the, it's time for us to, how come I can't get my music running here? I'm not entirely sure. But normally, a new development since you've been on last. I don't know if you've been listening to the show at all, but taking a break once in a while for not commercial announcements, but we'll take a 2-minute pause here at this point. Why we can't get our music, which normally introduces that break, playing, I can't tell you, but hang on for just a second. We'll be right back. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, interrupting this little break to say thanks so much to all of you who are contributing supporters of Kagro in the Morning. Thousands of you are downloading the show each day, but fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners are donating to help keep us on the air. For the money you'd spend on a single 3-minute iTunes song, we bring you 2 hours of great news and entertainment every day, 5 days a week. Patreon.com, Patreon.com makes it easy. You can find us there by searching Kagro X or David Waldman or Kagro in the Morning or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your support. Welcome back, at least I hope so, now to the Kagro in the Morning show here on Netroots Radio. Without my music, it's just so difficult. It's difficult to believe anything's happening properly without my music playing in the background. So I'm disoriented. But as we left off, we are now back with Ian Reifowitz, still joining us, talking about not only his latest Sunday piece, but just economics and tax policy in general, not in the usual sense, but in the Trumpian sense. There's a very strange and weird undercurrent going on along with these stories, and as you've done a great job in reconnecting us between the Donald Trump and Trump supporters we all know and dislike to some extent, and actual tax policy, so reminding us that this is not normal. Though it's normal for Republicans to want to pursue corporate tax cuts and tax cuts for the wealthy, is not necessarily your normal Republican ones. Though certainly any normal Republican administration would be pursuing the same goal, just not necessarily along the same path. I wanted to share with you before moving on to the latest news on that front. So as I just caught my eye yesterday, a tweet from Marcus Johnson, describes himself as a freelance writer and political scientist, and tweeting just the other day, I thought on this news, interestingly enough, on the trade war front, tweeting about here Newsweek's piece about Trump supporting soybean farmers, saying, as it says here, they'll gladly suffer, quote, to the death for his trade war. Which is interesting. The soybean farmers apparently being hit hard by foreign retaliatory tariffs, and put in place as retaliation against Trump's unilateral increase in tariffs against various of our trade partners. Marcus Johnson's observation here. Funny how the economic anxiety argument has gone, right? Proud to lose their savings and jobs under Trump. If they are proud to lose their money under Trump, why would free college or single payer from Dems change their minds? Glad people see economic anxiety as it was the farce that it was all along. It's an interesting point to bring up, and I guess for those who claimed that their allegiance to Trump was driven by economic anxiety, why you would then say, yeah, cut my throat again, cut my neighbor's throat, because we're making America great again through destroying my family farm. I don't know whether, I guess there's always, just as there's some portion of the population who voted both for Barack Obama and Donald Trump and might possibly be redeemable, well, there's always that segment that is irredeemable. I just didn't necessarily think it was going to be the people who Trump promised were going to see their America get great again and then be told that it wasn't, and then, yay, celebration. I can't wait to commit economic suicide on behalf of this promise of making my life better. I don't know that I can explain that.
not so easy to explain. I mean, look, I do think there's this idea that, step back for a second. As Democrats, we don't want to downplay economic anxiety, which is a phrase now that has become sort of one that we roll our eyes at, or many people roll their eyes at, but it's a real thing. And it doesn't have to do with how one's economic performance situation is in the moment. It's a fear about the future, right? That's what anxiety is. It's anxiety about the future, typically. And so it's these people have an anxiety about change. It's the economics, the culture, the demographics, all of these things are wrapped up in a sense that things are changing in a way that's going to be bad for them, or that the people who are going to be in charge don't care about them or don't have their interests at heart. That's really what underlies a lot of this, is the fear that, whether it's conscious or not conscious, that, a fear among these whites that when non-whites are in the majority or have political power, whatever, they're going to stick it to them, right? In economic terms, in terms of discrimination, in terms of whatever. And all of these things they're all connected. It's not economic anxiety or racial anxiety. It's economic anxiety and racial anxiety and status anxiety. They're all connected. So, I mean, I want to talk about the tax issue too, but I think one of the things we've got to figure out how to do if we want to, do better, progressives want to do better at the ballot box, which is the only way that progressives can institute the kinds of policies that will benefit the vulnerable, the economically vulnerable, the racially vulnerable, the gender, et cetera, vulnerable people, build a more inclusive society. You got to win elections. But in order to do that, one of the things we've got to do is figure out how do we lessen that anxiety, how do we make these anxious people feel a bit less anxious. And there are ways to do that without either sacrificing our values or being some sort of Trump light, which is ridiculous and I would never consider doing. You can talk about a future in which all people are going to be valued, in which you're talking about inclusion, when you're talking about principles like equality, when you talk about a common American identity. And Obama did all these things, and it's one of the reasons why he was able to not only win the electoral college, but win over more voters than we did in 2016. That message is a powerful message. It's not the only, it's a message that I don't think Democrats in 2016 did as good a job as they should have in emphasizing. And I don't want to go too far off the topic, but that's an important thing. We don't want to sit here and say, their economic concerns are irrelevant. When we say that, we have we give the impression that we don't care. And when we give the impression we don't care, then those voters who think we don't care about them tune us out. And that's something we need to avoid. But let's talk about this new tax stuff. But
it's a difficult thing to do at some point.
I was desperate to mention something, but I wanted to let you finish because I was smiling when you talked about the Trump situation being, not normal. And I'm thinking that you and I might be normally loopy, but that Trump's tax plan is abnormally loopy.
Yes. Well, I think so.
I'm holding on to that one for you.
Okay. We'll head right into it because I'm sure everyone has seen in the news by this point discussion of, and I was baffled by this one when I first saw it last night, and then things only got loopier from there. But Trump administration, it says here in the New York Times headline, is Trump administration mulls a unilateral tax cut for the rich. And I have to admit, at first I was baffled as to what is a unilateral tax cut. I'm not certain even what that's supposed to mean. And then reading on, it becomes obvious what they're talking about is one that they would enact from the executive branch alone. That would require no legislative action to cut taxes. And that's a novel approach to things. It actually made a certain amount of sense. I don't think it would be a wise idea to do, but I guess the thinking behind it is they're exploring inside the Treasury Department the possibility of changing whether or not they have the authority from a regulatory perspective of changing certain definitions in the tax code, which, and it is true that in sometimes in taxation legislation, the legislature will grant the Treasury Department, the IRS, et cetera, certain latitudes in coming up with their own regulations to the extent that they foster a stated legislative policy preference. But they're trying to find out whether they have the latitude to redefine, in technical terms, I guess, how you calculate the cost of, for instance, capital assets. Capital gains tax is what they're looking at monkeying with, as I understand it. But from a policy perspective, they're talking about another enormous tax cut of a size that's, I mean, I don't know. At this point, we just throw around big numbers and get, we're numb to the size of these things. But if I understand it correctly, they're talking about something that could cost the Treasury some $100 billion in mostly capital gains taxation, which, of course, I mean, you can tell us about the statistics there. How many people in America are ever claiming capital gains that they have to worry about capital gains taxation? But what's happening here? I mean, what do you know about it procedurally, or maybe nothing? I don't know. But certainly the message here of not only another tax cut, but we don't even need Congress, a Republican Congress, who presumably would give this to them. Are they talking about a tax cut that would be too crazy for Republicans in Congress? Or why consider doing this unilaterally at all?
Yeah. There are a few things that I guess you could say are too crazy for these Republicans in Congress.
Taxes
so let's
would
talk
never
about
be
this
one
a little
of
bit,
them.
right? And tax cuts, yeah. So yeah, you're talking about over $100 billion over 10 years with about 86%, right? Again, almost 90% of the benefits going to the top 1%, because that's who pays capital gains tax, because that's who owns stock.
Yeah.
They're talking about redefining the definition of the word cost, right? It depends on what the definition of is. And apparently they want to say that cost means something other than the price you paid for a share of stock or some other thing that you used capital to buy. They want to be able to index cost to inflation. Now, first of all, the George H.W. Bush White House apparently considered this back in 1992, and I guess in the days of less loopy Republicans determined that no, in fact, the Treasury Department didn't have the authority through regulation to redefine a word that has a plain meaning, like cost.
How much did that cost? Well,
I mean, it's ridiculous.
Depends.
First of all, we'd be redefining cost for capital gains purposes, but you wouldn't be redefining it for other tax purposes,
true.
Which is another issue. Anyway, simply the fact that you'd have to have a law passed to index the tax brackets for inflation suggests that indexing for inflation is something that has to be done by law. It can't be done by fiat. Mm-hmm. In terms of the politics of it, I mean, it just shows you how far from the supposedly populist campaign Trump this President Trump has moved, right? I mean, the campaign Trump, if you remember, had talked about raising taxes on the wealthy, right? Say, oh, maybe we pay too much. And we're going to have massive infrastructure programs to employ working class people. Well, that infrastructure plan, as far as I know, hasn't been passed unilaterally or multilaterally or anylaterally.
That's
but
true.
We have, right? We have had massive tax cuts for the rich, and now we're talking about more. If I'm the Democrats, this becomes right into the first paragraph of every stump speech of every candidate out there. That this is what Trump wants to do. He can't even get it through his crazy Republican Congress. He wants to do it by himself. You better elect some of us to get there and provide some kind of check on him before he becomes, before he gives away, the rest of the store to his billionaire friends. This is politically insane. I don't even know how they let it leak out. But it's clearly would be challenged in court. It would not happen. I mean, according to the experts you're reading about in this, what they were saying in this article about it, they would be shocked if it happened. Because interest payments are unadjusted for inflation, you could game the tax code, right? You could go out you could borrow money, deduct your interest costs, and then buy stock, and then over time, even though you'd have gains, you could balance those gains against inflation and sort of play one part of the tax code against the other, and game the system even more, which just goes further to show that that these loopholes and are designed to help the wealthy essentially pay as little as possible, and that's what Trump is trying to do here. So yeah, more power to you. Try this. I would dare Donald Trump to try and do this, because if it happens, it will be challenged in court and it would be political dynamite.
Okay. Well, I hope he takes you up on the job. No, although I hope nothing like this happens to blow a hole in the Treasury. Although I will say maybe they're missing out on something even more audacious that they could do. I mean, why, if they're going to index the cost or change the definition of cost such that it's indexed for inflation, wouldn't it be more, the free marketeers should be excited about the prospect of, well, the day you sell your stock, the market defines the cost of stock for you. It's the price you sold it at. Therefore, every stock sale is a net zero and there's no taxes at all. It doesn't matter what you paid for it and when. You sold it at cost. That's what the market determines cost to be. So there should be no capital gains tax on stock transactions at all. Why they're not jumping at that, I have no idea. Maybe that's too crazy for them. But
sounds pretty clever.
I don't know why they're not doing it. You tell me. That's an interesting one. I can't figure that one out. But this is what somebody pointed out, I think in this article, or perhaps it was elsewhere, but I've got open the New York Times piece on it. And it's not the only one I read on the subject. But somebody pointing out the $100 billion thing, I mean, has like rolled off our backs without blinking about it too much. Because, well, when you talk about 10-year costs for adjustments to the tax code, that we're very frequently speaking in those terms. But pointing out that, there was enormous controversy once about a $70 billion bailout financed by the Treasury Department as the biggest thing anybody had ever sought to spend Treasury money on ever. And that's all within our lifetimes. And now we're not blinking at floating $100 billion giveaway. And I don't know, maybe that's indexing for inflation. We no longer blink at $100 billion tax expenditures, I guess. But this one perhaps even more targeted than, at least it was arguable that the various bailouts, either for banks or auto manufacturers or whoever it was at the time, it was at least arguable that it was doing something to bolster an economy that would suck us all down the drain if we didn't. But yeah, I don't. Does anybody even argue at this point that any money would trickle out of this cut? That's not even being floated, I don't think.
Well, this is, that's the voodoo dream. That's the voodoo myth, right? Oh, when you give the rich more money, they'll, do X, Y, and Z with it, and magically it'll end up in Joe the plumber's pocket.
Right. Yes. I mean, that's frequently offered. But where I'm not seeing it is even when you buy, say, 10 yachts. Let's say you're a person who owns 10 yachts, or your family does. I mean, even that, I guess that was always the offering, even in Reagan days, is even if you spend it on yachts, somebody has to build that yacht. And yet, one, that's not really happening. And two, they seem to be buying yachts off of one another and they're not building new ones. And these super yachts very frequently not built in the United States anyway. But I'm not even seeing, maybe it's just too early in the game, but I'm not even seeing any effort to argue that capital gains tax savings would trickle down. Are we all just supposed to imply that for ourselves, or have they gotten lazy and they don't bother telling it, or I'm not certain which.
I don't know. Give them a few more days, maybe. But at some point, it's pushing on a string. Spending and even investing by the wealthy is really not going to change by them being given X number of more dollars. They buy what they want, and they invest what they want, irrespective of whether they have an extra 10 or 20 or 30 or $40,000. A. B. If all the wealthy people have X more dollars, then those things that they want will just cost a little bit more because there'll be an inflationary pressure up at the high end. And in fact, some of the arguments about the crashes, certainly the stock market crash of 2000, and then even worse, the recession of 2008, was you had too much liquidity floating around at the top. So things got bid up and bid up and bid up beyond any kind of real value. And because when you have an economy, with that much inequality, it becomes that much more unstable. And it's no accident that the measures of economic inequality in our country's history in 2000 reached the highest point since what year? 1929. That's another year that should ring a bell, right?
Yes.
So if you want to have a stable economy, one that has stable growth, then a better way to do it is to avoid that kind of inequality. Make sure that the people, middle class, working class people who are able to earn decent living, are able to support their families, but also make sure that they have a decent share of the wealth in a society, because that's a way of creating a more stable economy, as well as a more fair or a more just economy. So what's good for the middle class and what's good for the working class is actually also good for the overall economy. And in many ways, what's best for the wealthy is actually bad for the overall economy. It's just a matter of getting people to see that when they go to vote, and you have to make that argument to them. And that's the Democrats' best way to win back some of these white working class voters that they've lost, and they really don't have to do much. Moving a percentage or two in these parts of the country that the Electoral College gives disproportionate weight to, would swing the balance. I mean, and that's where we're all looking towards in 2020, and this fall.
Yes. Well, first of all, although the Electoral College doesn't enter into it, but based on the same system, I mean, the Electoral College is divided up the same way we've divided things up in Congress, and all of which deserves a second look at this stage. You said something interesting that piqued my interest as you were describing that piling up yet more wealth in the hands of the wealthy who have everything they need, and certainly and anything they could possibly want. That might need an 11th yacht, I don't know. But it has an inflationary effect, which, of course, is interesting because we've just talked about how we need to index the costs of their investments to inflation. And as they drive those inflationary effects to new heights, I guess that would, I guess under the new definitions, would just create bigger and bigger losses to the Treasury as we go along, too. Sort of a weird hyperloop of inflating their own net worth. And of course, also, I guess now much discussed in the news, I see a piece today in the Atlantic, Annie Lowry's piece, are stock buybacks starving the economy? It's easy to sort of figure out how that's happening. But as you mentioned, the top 1% in the country owning something like 90% of the stock. But in addition to that, and if you take even a smaller view of who owns the stock, corporate board members and executives who own large chunks of their own company. This was supposed to be an economic reform in the sort of the post-Reagan boom days. You want your officers of the company owning stock in the company so that they have an incentive to see the stock perform for investors, as they represent a bigger and bigger chunk of the investors in any given company, and as their compensation is tied to stock performance. I imagine we make no control for this at the corporate compensation level. People whose paychecks are tied to the performance of stock voting to direct corporate cash reserves to be used to buy back that stock from the investing public, and therefore, obviously, if you're making bids to buy the stuff, you're driving the stock price up, so you're able to report quarterly that the stock price is up, so your own compensation is increased. Plus, you get the benefit of being able to sell those additional shares of stock that you've bought back and awarded to yourself for the genius of inflating the price and of the stock that your own compensation is based on. This seems like, maybe a faster feedback loop to another crash than you'd want to implement.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. And I will note that, by the way, now we've had a normal loop, we've had the abnormal loop, and now we've got the hyper loop. We've really done a nice job of covering the various loops on this show.
Yes.
But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, the statistic I had in my post was that the wealthiest 10% of households own 84% of the total stock market. We saw from the article about the new unilateral tax cut it was 86. They would get 86% of the benefit from this capital gains cut. Look, that's exactly right. All of this, it connects to a lot of other things. It connects to the fact that, corporate CEO pay used to be about 30 times the average worker of his or her company's salary, and now it's more like 300 times the average worker at their company. Why? Well, because we used to have higher tax rates on high salaries, so it wasn't even in the interests. It wouldn't even benefit the CEO that much to get a super high salary, because at some point they'd be just paying it more back into the treasury. Well, now you've got this change in tax code, and so the CEOs and the boards that appoint them want to give high salaries, because it now it's actually going to the pockets of the CEOs, and they get more compensation, through stock options, which are taxed at a lower capital gains rate now than they were before Reagan. So it's a loop-de-loop, if you will.
I guess so. Well, we really were loopier than usual today. All right. Well, Ian, thanks very much. I think we're coming to the end of the show. We'll wrap things up for today. Thank you very much for coming back after all this time. I'm glad I forget to take advantage of your summers off. I don't know if they're all off. I'm sure you have other work to do.
You're very welcome. I'm always happy to come on, and we'll do this again. We won't wait so long till next time.
I hope not. Okay, well, lots to think about, and this will be a subject in the news, particularly as we wind down August. Congress returning briefly, I'm sure, to do some work. Not that any of it's necessary, according to the Treasury Department, but wide-ranging discussion, as always, and an important one. Thanks, Ian. Take care.
You too.
All right. Ian Reifowitz, again, our resident professor, and thanks for coming on and letting us know what you're professing these days. We'll look out for more Sunday pieces from you and more research to come. Oh, you know what? Let's see. I think all of my buttons have gone here, Ian, and you may have to be the one that disconnects from this call. All right, there we are. Okay. Does that give me... I've experienced a very weird loss of control from my end of things here. This probably means, I'm wondering, how am I going to recover from this? Because it probably means I'm going to be unable to end the show properly. I don't know exactly what has lost our ability to control this thing, but I'm scrambling now for trying to figure out what options are available to me if the controls aren't working here. My mouse no longer working, and I'm just not sure how we're going to be able to get things to go here, but let's try this. I wonder if now, maybe that has given me control back. Crossing the fingers and hoping against hope that everything works when it comes time to click. Otherwise, we'll fix it for the podcast. Fix it in post, as they say in Hollywood. And also look out for that hole in the sidewalk over on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, as they now say, now that Donald Trump's star has been vandalized once again. All right, there we go. I think it was just, you know what? For those of you who are tech savvy, it was just a matter of turning things off and turning it back on again, which is always what you advise us to do first. In this case, turn off and then turn back on the so-called magic mouse. Thank you very much, Apple, for giving me the magic mouse that goes with it. The magic was gone for just a little while, and it cost us the slick production value that we usually are able to depend on for our exit and re-entry from our non-commercial commercial break. Anyway, at least the music is working now, and that means I have a pleasant musical bed over which to tell you something about what's coming up next on the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Justice Putnam. We'll take it slowly and at a relaxed pace. Get this. A Koch network flack tries to recruit Democrats on CNN with Wolf Blitzer as the straight man. I cannot even envision how that one goes down. You tune in to Justice's program to figure it out. He'll figure it out along with you and make it all clear. On the rest of the menu, a 2012 ruling by Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, you know that guy, made sure Trump was able to screw over his own casino workers. And a Koch-based backed study finds Medicare for All would save the U.S. trillions of dollars.
On netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
I did see that this morning President Trump was tweeting about the Koch brothers now becoming a joke in Republican circles. I don't know what that's all about. Maybe it's connected. How about this one? Trump's tariffs on aluminum and steel would add a $350 million tax on your beer. What? On beer? You know the white working class won't stand for that. All coming up next.